On April 17, 1994, inside a small apartment in the Mayport area of Jacksonville, Florida, 20-year-old Tina Livernash Heins was found dead. She wasn't just another face in a headline. She was young. She was loved. She was around 15 weeks pregnant, and she had been planning for a future that was supposed to be just beginning. But that morning, her future was over. She had been stabbed 27 times. Not once, not twice, 27 times. Each thrust of the knife more violent than the last. Each wound speaking to rage, to fury, or to something darker that words struggled to describe. 27 times means someone didn't just want her gone. They wanted her erased. And yet, as horrifying as that detail is, it was only part of the nightmare discovered inside that apartment. Subscribe to this channel for more real-life cold cases that have been solved. Every view, like, and comment keeps these victims' names alive and ensures their stories are not forgotten. Drop your city or country in the comments, and I will create a video on a cold case from your area, because every community has stories that deserve to be told. When investigators entered, they didn't just find Tina's body. They found an environment that felt staged, manipulated, almost theatrical in its chaos. There were 3 small fires burning inside the home, fires that hadn't consumed the apartment entirely, but had clearly been set with intention. One in the kitchen, another in the living room, and, disturbingly, one directly on the sofa. That sofa wasn't just another piece of furniture. It was where Chad Heins, Tina's brother-in-law, had been asleep during the night. He claimed he woke to the smell of smoke and the glow of fire, scrambled to put them out, and ripped the smoke alarm from the ceiling to silence its piercing shriek. After extinguishing the flames, he made his way toward Tina's bedroom, unaware of the horror he was about to uncover. Inside that room, his sister-in-law lay motionless. 27 stab wounds, a violent death that no one could make sense of. To understand how strange and unsettling this scene was, you have to picture Tina's life at that moment. She shared the apartment with her husband, Jeremy Heins, and his brother, Chad. It wasn't unusual in a Navy town like Mayport. Jeremy was serving on active duty, spending long stretches away at sea, and his younger brother had moved in temporarily. Families in military communities often leaned on each other, combining households to manage the absences and long deployments that come with service. But on the night of April 16th, Jeremy wasn't home. His ship was out. That left Tina and Chad in the apartment, she in her room, asleep with the weight of pregnancy and the exhaustion of a long day. He stretched out on the living room sofa. 2 family members separated by little more than a thin wall and a few feet of hallway. By the time morning came, one of them was dead. The other was the first to find her. Think about this for a moment. Not just the violence itself, but the sheer atmosphere of it. A 20-year-old woman expecting a child, stabbed dozens of times in her own bedroom. Fires lit in the very space she called home. A man waking to flames crackling beneath him, dousing the sparks, silencing alarms, only to walk into a room and find blood soaking the walls of what should have been a sanctuary. The image forces questions you can't shake. Who was capable of stabbing a pregnant woman 27 times? Why set fires? Small, almost pitiful attempts at destruction, rather than simply flee the scene. And how could such brutality erupt in a space that, only hours before, was filled with nothing more than the ordinary sounds of sleep? For anyone listening in 1994, the story didn't feel like something distant. It felt personal. It cut too close. And even today, hearing it now, it demands that you pause, that you imagine those final moments. What makes this case so unsettling is the guilt it presses onto its audience. It's not just about the murder itself, it's about the way we process stories like this. You picture Tina, young and expectant, her life unfolding in small routines, watching TV, preparing meals, writing letters to her husband at sea. You picture her carrying her unborn child, quietly building a future in a modest Mayport apartment. And then you picture the knife, over and over again. That contrast between the ordinary life she lived and the extraordinary cruelty that ended it creates a kind of guilt in anyone who hears it. Guilt that we weren't there. Guilt that no one stopped it. Guilt that such violence could befall someone who seemed so undeserving of it. And yet, as horrifying as the crime scene was, it only opens the door to deeper questions. Because nothing about that morning made sense. Why were there 3 fires but no effort to burn the entire apartment down? Why stab someone 27 times, then linger long enough to try covering it up with such small, scattered flames? Why target Tina at all? A young, pregnant woman with no enemies, no debts, no history of trouble. The picture, even in those first hours, was fractured. It was a puzzle that refused to lock together. And if you've ever tried to sleep after hearing a story like this, you know exactly what happens. The unanswered questions keep you awake. They roll through your mind like thunder you can't shut out. That's the power of this case. It doesn't just disturb, it compels. It forces you to keep watching, to keep listening, because something inside demands an explanation. So here's investigators knew about that morning. April 17, 1994. 20-year-old Tina Livernash Heins is found dead in her apartment in Jacksonville, Mayport, Florida. She is about 15 weeks pregnant at the time. She has been stabbed 27 times. There are 3 small fires in the apartment. In the kitchen, in the living room, and on the sofa. Her brother-in-law, Chad Heins, claims to have been asleep on that sofa, waking to smoke, extinguishing the flames, silencing the alarm, and then discovering Tina's body. Her husband, Jeremy, is away, serving on ship duty with the Navy. That is the foundation. That is the raw, undeniable reality of the case. A young woman murdered in her home, surrounded by details that only raise more questions than they answer. One of the most troubling aspects of any homicide investigation. When the pursuit of justice moves too fast, too narrowly, and too recklessly, so fast, in fact, that it overshoots the truth. The case of Tina Heins in Jacksonville, Florida, reveals just how devastating tunnel vision can be, and how an innocent man can lose years of his life to a crime he didn't commit. After Tina was found brutally murdered in April 1994, investigators almost immediately shifted their attention not to an unknown suspect, but inward, to her own family circle. Their eyes landed on one man, Chad Heins, Tina's brother-in-law. But why Chad? The police would later claim it was because Chad was the only other person in the apartment that night. He had been staying with his brother Jeremy and Tina while trying to get back on his feet. On paper, that already made him suspicious. Add to it the fact that Chad was young, unemployed, and reportedly had some difficulties with responsibility. And suddenly, in the investigators' minds, he didn't just fit the opportunity, he became the opportunity. But suspicion alone doesn't build a conviction. So how did the prosecution manage to put Chad away for life in 1996? They leaned heavily on 2 critical things. 1, jailhouse informants, and 2, a manufactured narrative of motive and opportunity. Before we continue deeper into this case, take a second to subscribe. I cover true stories like this every week, solved and unsolved. You won't want to miss the next one. Let's start with the jailhouse informants. If you've ever studied wrongful convictions, you already know this is a red flag. Jailhouse snitches often have every reason to lie, reduced sentences, dropped charges, or even special privileges in exchange for their testimony. And in Chad's case, that's exactly what happened. A pair of inmates came forward claiming that Chad had confessed to them while behind bars. Think about that for a second. A young man accused of murdering his sister-in-law, placed in a violent environment where information is currency, and suddenly, other inmates magically overhear him, giving details that align with the state's theory. But these so-called confessions didn't match the physical evidence. Not even close. The crime scene told a different story. There was no blood on Chad, not a drop. And remember, Tina's death had been incredibly violent. She had been stabbed more than 24 times. The killer would have been drenched. Yet Chad's clothes, body, and belongings showed nothing. Chad had no injuries, not even the defensive marks one would expect if he had fought his victim at close range. The most damning evidence? The DNA. Under Tina's fingernails were skin cells, belonging to a man who was not Chad and not Jeremy. On her body, investigators found a semen stain. Again, not Chad. Her pubic hairs? They belonged to someone else entirely. The evidence was screaming that an unknown male had been there that night. But here's the chilling part. That evidence was downplayed, brushed aside, and in some cases, outright ignored. The prosecution told the jury that DNA can be contaminated, that it didn't necessarily point to the killer. Instead, they doubled down on their theory that Chad alone had the motive and opportunity. And if the jury had doubts, well, the informant's confessions neatly filled those gaps. Then there's the fingerprint. On the bathroom faucet, a place the killer almost certainly would have touched to wash off blood, investigators lifted a clear print. It didn't belong to Tina. It didn't belong to Jeremy, and it didn't belong to Chad. So ask yourself, why wasn't this treated as crucial evidence? Why wasn't this mysterious print the foundation of a wider investigation? The answer is simple. Once law enforcement locked their sights on Chad, the case was no longer about finding the truth. It was about building a case strong enough to convince a jury. And in 1996, it worked. The jury found Chad Heins guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge handed down a life sentence. But let's pause here and think carefully. How does a man with no blood on his body, no defensive wounds, and no DNA tying him to the murder scene end up convicted of killing someone in such a violent manner? How do jailhouse rumors outweigh scientific evidence? And why did no one in the courtroom stand up and say, "Wait, if all the biological evidence belongs to another man, shouldn't we be looking for him instead?" This is the point in the story where you have to ask yourself, was this justice, or was this desperation? Did investigators really believe Chad was guilty, or were they under such pressure to close a high-profile case that they chose the most convenient target? What does it say about a system when someone can be convicted on the words of criminals with something to gain, while DNA evidence pointing to an unknown perpetrator sits on a shelf, collecting dust? By the time the verdict was read, Chad was only in his early 20s. Imagine that, you're barely an adult, suddenly branded a murderer, locked away for life. Meanwhile, the real killer, the person whose DNA and fingerprints were literally on the victim, remained unidentified and free. And here's where the story turns from tragedy to outrage, because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a misdirection of justice. Every piece of ignored evidence didn't just fail Chad, it failed Tina. Because when investigators silenced the DNA, when they ignored the fingerprint, when they clung to informant testimony that served their narrative, they also turned their backs on Tina's truth. They closed her case on the wrong man, leaving her real killer untouched. So now the question becomes, how many years does it take for truth to claw its way back into the light? How long can a wrongful conviction stand, even when the evidence has been whispering all along that they got the wrong man. And when that truth finally does surface, what happens to the people who spent decades insisting they were right? The answers are as unsettling as they are revealing, and in the case of Tina Heins, they would take years of appeals, of new DNA testing, of relentless fighting, before the truth began to break through the cracks. But by then, the damage had already been done. Forensic DNA testing was advancing rapidly in the early 2000s, giving investigators sharper tools to separate truth from assumption. And that's where hope re-entered Chad Heins' story. Attorneys working on his appeals petitioned the court for something investigators in 1994 had dismissed: a comprehensive re-examination of the biological evidence. New methods could test even the smallest trace of genetic material with accuracy that was impossible just years earlier. The results were nothing short of damning, not for Chad, but for the original investigation. Every single piece of biological evidence pointed in one direction, and it wasn't toward Chad. The semen stain collected from Tina's body excluded both Chad and Jeremy. The pubic hairs recovered excluded both Chad and Jeremy. The skin cells found under Tina's fingernails, likely belonging to her killer, again excluded both Chad and Jeremy. This wasn't a case of ambiguous results or contamination, as the prosecution had once argued. The DNA testing was clear, consistent, and undeniable. Someone else, an unidentified man, was in that apartment the night Tina was murdered. Imagine being Chad in that moment, sitting in a cell year after year, branded a murderer. And now, science was proving what he had been saying all along. I didn't do it. The new DNA results forced the justice system to confront its mistake. In December 2006, the court vacated Chad's conviction. After more than 11 years behind bars, he was finally recognized, not as a killer, but as a man wrongfully imprisoned. But even then, freedom didn't come instantly. The state hesitated. Prosecutors stalled, weighing whether they could possibly retry the case, despite the DNA pointing elsewhere. And here's where the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. Think about it. Even with evidence screaming his innocence, Chad had to wait in limbo as prosecutors debated whether to admit they were wrong. That limbo ended in 2007, when prosecutors finally made it official. They dropped all charges against Chad Heins. Just like that, the state closed its case, without finding the real killer, without accountability for the years stolen, and without a single apology that could make up for the damage. When the charges were dismissed, headlines across Florida lit up with the news. To the public, it seemed like justice had finally been served. But to Chad, it wasn't so simple. Yes, he was free. Yes, his name was cleared. But what about the 11 years he would never get back? 11 years of birthdays missed. 11 years of being branded a murderer by strangers. 11 years of waking up every day inside a cell, knowing you're innocent, knowing the world outside has moved on without you. And beyond Chad's suffering, what about Tina? Her case, already mishandled, was now colder than ever. The evidence clearly pointed to another man, but by then, critical time had been lost. Leads had gone stale. Witnesses had disappeared. The real killer had lived freely for more than a decade. The aftermath of Chad's exoneration raises painful questions. How does someone rebuild their life after losing so much? Can the system ever repay the debt it owes to those wrongfully convicted? And perhaps most haunting, who was the man behind the DNA? Chad walked out of prison in 2007, technically free, but freedom doesn't erase trauma. He had to relearn life outside, carry the stigma of a wrongful conviction, and face the reality that while he had survived prison, he could never fully escape the shadow of what happened. For Tina's family, the exoneration brought its own storm of emotions. Relief that an innocent man was cleared, frustration that the real killer had been overlooked, and grief all over again, knowing that Tina's case had been mishandled for more than a decade. Wrongful convictions don't happen in a vacuum. They expose systemic flaws in police investigations, in prosecutorial tactics, and in the reliance on unreliable witnesses like jailhouse informants. The Heins case is a textbook example. Instead of following the DNA, investigators followed a narrative. Instead of keeping the focus on truth, they built a case that could win in court. And the cost of that choice was enormous. An innocent man behind bars, a family misled, and a murderer still at large. So here's the question you have to wrestle with. If it took 11 years and a revolution in forensic science to free Chad, how many other men and women are sitting in prison right now, waiting for the same miracle? How many other cases have DNA pointing in one direction, while the system insists on looking the other way? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, if the real killer in Tina's case walked free for over a decade, where was he? And what else did he do? The exoneration of Chad Heins wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning, one that forces us to confront not only how Tina's case was handled, but how fragile justice itself can be. For nearly 2 full decades, that question went unanswered. The evidence, the DNA profile of an unknown male, sat in state and federal databases, waiting for a hit. Year after year, as forensic technology improved, investigators would occasionally recheck, but nothing. The killer's genetic fingerprint remained unmatched, like a ghost woven into the system. What do you do when you have the killer's DNA, but no name? For nearly 20 years? Tina's family never stopped pressing for resolution. They held on to her memory. The young woman, just 20 years old, newly married, expecting her first child. And they wanted accountability for the brutality she endured. They wrote letters. They pushed detectives. They called attention to the case whenever anniversaries came around. For them, Tina wasn't just a name in an old case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a loved one whose life had been stolen in the cruelest way. But pushing for answers came with its own torment. Every year that passed was another year of silence. Another year of knowing the person who murdered Tina might be walking among them, shopping in a grocery store, sitting in a diner, living a normal life while Tina's own was cut short. The heart of the case was always the same: the unknown male DNA profile. For the detectives who cared, it was maddening. They had the killer's genetic blueprint, yet no identity to attach to it. It was like staring at a completed puzzle with the final piece missing. And this is where the story grows colder and darker. Science has a way of catching up to those who believe they can outrun time. And in 2025, time finally caught up with the man who had hidden in plain sight. This is the story of the breakthrough that cracked open one of Florida's most haunting cold cases, and the shocking arrest that followed. The key was forensic genetic genealogy, a technology that blends cutting-edge DNA science with the growing world of public genealogy databases. Here's how it works. Instead of waiting for a direct DNA match in CODIS, investigators upload the unknown profile into genealogical systems that track distant relatives. Even if the killer has never been arrested, his cousins, uncles, or distant family members might have. From there, skilled genetic genealogists can begin building family trees, branch by branch, generation by generation, until they land on the person whose DNA cannot be ignored. And that's exactly what happened with Tina's case. In 2025, detectives partnered with Othram Labs, a forensic genomics company known for solving some of the toughest cold cases in America. The unknown male DNA from Tina's body and fingernails, untouched, unmatched for decades, was run through the system once again. This time, the technology didn't shrug in silence. It whispered a name. Through painstaking genealogical reconstruction, Othram scientists followed the DNA's path through branches of family trees until it began to point toward one man, Michael Shane Ziegler. By then, Ziegler was 52 years old, living quietly in Covington, Georgia, nearly 400 miles from where Tina's life had been cut short. On paper, he looked ordinary. A man who had moved on with life, blending into the background. But DNA does not forget. The match was not speculation. It was science. The same genetic code that once left its trace on Tina's body now betrayed its owner 3 decades later. And when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered connections that made this revelation even more chilling. The man identified as Tina's killer wasn't a stranger. He wasn't an anonymous intruder. He was someone close enough to attend her wedding. Michael Shane Ziegler had served in the Navy alongside Jeremy Heins, Tina's husband. He was a friend to the family. He had watched Tina and Jeremy exchange vows. He had sat among their loved ones, clapping and smiling, hiding the face of a predator in plain sight. Think about that for a moment. The man now accused of stabbing Tina 27 times, of setting fires to cover his crime, had once been welcomed into the most intimate moments of her life. This wasn't random violence. This was betrayal woven into friendship. And it explained something investigators had always wrestled with. How did the killer gain access? How did he enter that apartment on a quiet April night without forcing his way in? The answer may have been simple. Tina likely knew him. She may have let him in willingly, never imagining the danger that stood on her doorstep. Once the genetic genealogy pointed squarely to Ziegler, detectives moved swiftly. They built their case carefully, ensuring the DNA matched beyond any shadow of doubt. When the evidence was airtight, they made their move. On September 4, 2025, in Covington, Georgia, law enforcement knocked on Michael Ziegler's door. Imagine that moment. For more than 30 years, Ziegler had walked freely. He had aged, perhaps grown comfortable, perhaps even confident that his secret had been buried with time. But in that instant, with officers surrounding his home, the past came crashing back. Neighbors watched as he was placed in handcuffs. A man who had lived beside them as a quiet middle-aged resident was suddenly revealed as the accused killer in a decades-old cold case. For Tina's family, the news of the arrest was staggering. After years of pushing for answers, after living with the weight of an unsolved murder, they finally had a name. They finally had someone to hold accountable. The charges were as serious as the crime itself. First-degree murder and sexual battery, the very charges that reflected the brutality of Tina's final moments. This was not simply about closure. It was about justice. The system that once failed Tina by convicting the wrong man was now given a second chance to set the record straight. Ziegler was quickly extradited back to Jacksonville, Florida, the city where the crime had taken place. There, he was booked into custody and ordered to be held without bond. The symbolism was undeniable. Decades after walking away from Tina's apartment, Ziegler would now sit in a cell of his own. As of today, Michael Shane Ziegler remains behind bars, awaiting trial. Prosecutors in Jacksonville are preparing their case, building their timeline, and preparing to confront a man who may have believed he had escaped accountability forever. And here lies the most haunting truth. Had it not been for genetic genealogy, this case might still be cold. Tina's killer might still be free. The very tool that identified Ziegler is the same tool now revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. The arrest also reopens old wounds. For Tina's family, it's a bittersweet victory. Justice is finally in sight, but it comes decades too late. Tina never got to raise her child. Her husband, Jeremy, who once counted Ziegler as a friend, must now live with the knowledge that betrayal struck from within his own circle. And then there is Chad Heins, the man who spent 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. What must he have felt, learning that the true suspect was not only alive, but someone close to his own family? The exoneration freed him, but the arrest of Ziegler redefines the story. And yet, even with an arrest, questions linger. Why did Ziegler do it? Was the crime premeditated, or did something trigger it that night? Did he act alone, or could there be details still hidden in the shadows? And the most unsettling question of all, what has Ziegler been doing during the 30 years he spent free? If he could commit such brutality at age 21, what stopped him from doing it again? These are the questions that will shape not only the trial, but the legacy of this case. The arrest of Michael Shane Ziegler is not just the end of a cold case. It's a reminder of how fragile justice can be. It shows us the danger of tunnel vision, the cost of wrongful convictions, and the power of science to rewrite history. For Tina's family, this is not closure. It's a step, a long overdue step toward accountability. For the public, it's a story that forces us to ask, how many other killers are still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the day when their DNA tells the truth? And for Tina, it's a moment of dignity restored. After decades of silence, her story now has a name attached to the horror she endured. The case is no longer just unknown DNA, it is Michael Shane Ziegler. The question now is simple. Will the courts deliver the justice that Tina has been denied for more than 30 years? The case of Tina Heins stands as a haunting reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the justice system. It illustrates the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the devastating ripple effects of wrongful convictions, and the life-saving value of scientific innovation in forensics. Decades after Tina's life and that of her unborn child were cut short, her case embodies both the failures of the past and the promise of modern justice. One of the most significant lessons of this case is how tunnel vision can derail justice. In the immediate aftermath of Tina's murder in 1994, investigators quickly focused on her brother-in-law, Chad Heins. Despite a lack of solid physical evidence linking him to the crime, prosecutors leaned heavily on circumstantial clues and unreliable jailhouse informant testimony. The eagerness to close the case, combined with a narrowed focus on a single suspect, led to Chad's wrongful conviction. He would spend more than a decade behind bars before DNA testing cleared him. This miscarriage of justice underscores how easily the drive for resolution can overshadow the pursuit of truth, and how devastating the consequences are for the accused, the victim's family, and the public's trust. Another crucial takeaway is the importance of preserving biological evidence. The small traces of DNA collected from the crime scene in 1994 eventually proved to be the linchpin in unraveling the truth. Had this evidence been lost, degraded, or destroyed, as often happened in cases from the 1980s and 1990s, the opportunity for exoneration and eventual identification of the real suspect might have been lost forever. The Heins case shows why the careful preservation of forensic samples is not just good practice. It can mean the difference between an unsolved crime and eventual justice. It also highlights why law enforcement agencies today are investing in secure long-term storage and re-examination of cold case evidence. The eventual breakthrough in 2025 came through forensic genetic genealogy, an investigative tool barely imaginable at the time of the crime. By building family trees through genealogical databases, investigators were able to trace the unknown male DNA to Michael Shane Ziegler. This technique has emerged as a revolution in cold casework, solving crimes that once seemed destined to remain mysteries. For Tina's case, it not only identified a suspect but also revealed the tragic betrayal of trust. Ziegler was a close friend of Tina's husband, attended their wedding, and had once been part of their inner circle. After nearly 31 years, the arrest of Ziegler opens the possibility of long-delayed justice. While the legal process is ongoing, the Heins family now has reason to believe that truth has finally come to light. The case serves as both a cautionary tale about the perils of flawed investigations and an inspiring example of how science and persistence can eventually restore hope. For Tina Heins and her unborn child, the path to justice, though decades in the making, may at last be within reach. True crime is not just about the horror of what happened, but the lessons we take away. If you believe Tina Livernash Heins' name should never be forgotten, hit the like button and share this video so more people hear her story.